Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and we are going to be talking about maga akum or stam yenam, and not really yayin nesach. Meaning, we're going to be talking about the prohibition for a non-Jew to touch, pour, shake up Jewish wine if it is not boiled, mevushal, and or the prohibition to drink wine that belongs to a Gentile. Again, if it is not boiled, mevushal. I want to talk about this prohibition because given the fact that most of the non-Jews that we interact with today are not idolaters, do not actually have pagan beliefs, especially if you follow the Baalei Tosfot and you don't look at the Trinity in Christianity as Avodah Zarah for non-Jews, but only as Avodah Zarah for Jews. We really need to understand the logic behind Stam Yenam, the prohibition of drinking Gentile wine, and Maga'akum, the prohibition of a Gentile to touch, move, shake Jewish wine. So I want to actually look at two different logic models for what the source of these prohibitions is. The first model that I want to look at is the model presented by the Rambam. And the model presented by the Rambam really looks like it's all about yayin nesach. Our real concern is not stam yenam, the wine that belongs to a Gentile. Our real concern is not maga akum, a Gentile touching Jewish wine. Our real concern is the possibility of libation to Avodah Zarah. Libation to Avodah Zarah would be asur min haTorah. And so the way the Rambam puts it is he starts with yayin nesach, wine that was a libation to Avodah Zarah. And then he moves on to the other two categories. Let's take a look in Mishnah Torah, Machalot Asurot, Perek Yud. Yayin shenitnasech la'akum asur b'hanaya, wine that has been poured out as a libation to idolatry is prohibited not only for a Jew to drink, but it is prohibited for a Jew to derive any benefit from, right? So you can't use it as money, you can't trade, can't make money off it. And if a person drinks any amount, they get malkot, they get lashes on a biblical level. I skipped a little bit to Halakha 3, where he then moves on to stam yenam. Yain akum she'ein anu yod'in im nitnasech o lo nitnasech. The wine of a non-Jew, and specifically here he's talking about a pagan, where we don't know if it was used, poured out as a libation for Avodah Zarah or not. V'hu hanikra stam yenam, and that is called stam, meaning vague, right? Vague, their wine which is vague. Asur b'hana'a kimo yayin shenitnasech. That too is prohibited not only to drink for a Jew, but also to derive benefit, just like yayin nesach, just like wine that was used as a libation. V'davar zeh migzerot sofrimhu. And this is a decree of literally the scribes. Let's just call it a rabbinic decree. V'hashote mistam yenam revi'it, if you drink a revi'it of stam yenam, wine that belongs to a Gentile that you didn't know whether or not it was used as a libation, akinoto makat mardut, we give you lashes, but they're midirabanan lashes. They're rabbinic lashes called makot mardut, lashes for being rebellious. And then he moves on to maga akum, a non-Jew touching Jewish wine. V'chol yayin she'yigabo ha'akum hareze asur, and any wine that a non-Jew touches, and here again he's talking about a pagan, it seems, is also prohibited. Shema nisechoto, because maybe in touching it, moving it, that pagan actually was thinking, this is a libation. Because a pagan thinks about paganism. Halamadata sheyen Yisrael shenaga bo ha'akum dino kistam yenam shehu asur b'hanaya. A Bahanaya. That teaches you that Jewish wine that was touched by a pagan is considered like stam yenam. It's considered like Gentile wine, where we don't know what's happened to it, if it's been a libation or not. And it too is prohibited even in getting deriving benefit. So it seems quite clear that the issue here is we want to prevent yayin nesach. We want to prevent libations. That is the reason for this. And in fact, you do see in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph an incident between Shmuel and Avlet. Avlet seems to be a Gentile scholar who's sitting with him, or a Gentile who's sitting with him. I'm saying scholar because that's what the translation says, but I don't know who Avlet is. Havoyatve, they're sitting together. Aitu lekamayu chamar mevashala, and they actually brought wine that had been cooked, right? Yayin mevushal. Mashche liyade, Avlet moved his hand away so as not to touch it. Amr le Shmuel, and Shmuel says, Hare amru yayin mevushal ein bo mishum yayin nesach. And Shmuel said to him, you don't have to turn your hand away, because if it's boiled, if it's cooked, there's no yayin nesach there. Now, why not? The Gemara explains, because that's not what they use for libations. They don't use cooked wine or boiled wine for libations. So if the whole reason is we want to make sure that this doesn't become yayin nesach, then it makes perfect sense that if something is mevushal, they don't use it for yayin nesach, and therefore we don't have to worry about it for stam yenam either, and we don't have to worry about it for maga akum either. But there's a whole other line of reasoning as to why stam yenam and why maga akum ultimately would be asurim, would be prohibited. And that line actually has to do with marriage, intermarriage, that we don't want intermarriage. So, for example, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Bet, and also the Gemara in Shabbat on Yud Zayin Amud Bet, they both say, Gazru al pitan v'shamnan mishum yenan. They issued the decree not in prohibiting Gentile bread and Gentile oil, which you learned about a few weeks ago, because of Gentile wine. V'al yenan mishum b'notehen. And Gentile wine is asur because of their daughters, meaning we don't want you partying and drinking with Gentiles, and we're worried about intermarriage. And if you want to know what the sugya on intermarriage is, it's Avodah Zarah Lamed Vav Amud Bet, the conversation about, well, isn't there already an isser of intermarriage? Why do you need something that's going to be an extra gzera to keep it from happening? That's a whole conversation there. And that really gives rise to a very different logic model behind stam yenam and even maga akum. And in fact, the Ramban backs up the idea that stam yenam is based on a fear of intermarriage, a concern for intermarriage, by basically saying, we also saw the Gemara talking about whether you should be worried that a non-Jew has worshipped an animal and is then selling it to you. And there's a logic that's offered in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah on 22b, Kav Bet Amud Bet. It says, Im ita de akte, v'im ita de palche, if the non-Jew, if the pagan had set aside that animal or had worshipped that animal, lo hava mizabin lei, they wouldn't be selling it to you in the first place. And so the Ramban basically says, I want to use that logic when it comes to stam yenam. Right? He says, I think when it comes to stam yenam, as it says at the beginning of our chapter, if this was something they were setting aside for their Avodah Zarah, they wouldn't have sold it to you. Likewise here, if this was something that the person had used as a libation for Avodah Zarah, they wouldn't have sold it to you. And I might even say, kal v'chomer, they wouldn't be giving it to you as a gift, right? We don't have to worry about the issue of yayin nesach when it comes to stam yenam. The issue is not we're worried that it was a libation. Ela mishum b'notehen hu degazera be'rabanan. Actually, the decree is because we are concerned about intermarriage, right? That's actually where the decree comes from. Now, I will say, interestingly enough, the Rashba in his Torah Tabayit says actually it's both. It's intermarriage and Avodah Zarah, one stacked on top of the other. It says V'asru stam yinam kedei lehidrachek mehem umimisibotehem, and they prohibited stam yinam, the wine that we're not sure exactly what's happened to it or hasn't happened to, that belongs to a Gentile, in order to stay away from them and their parties. Shemesibotehem meviot lidei chatnut, v'liznut im bnotehen, right? The going to parties together is going to lead to intermarriage, and it's going to lead to sexual promiscuity with their daughters, meaning with pagan women. Uznut bnotehen mevi lidei avodat elilim. And actually, that znut, that promiscuity with their daughters, is actually going to lead to Avodah Zarah. Kederach she'asu meshitim, like the sins at Shittim in the book of Bamidbar. Tichtiv, as it says, v'tikrena la'am lezivchei Eloheim. They seduced the men, and they brought them over to worship, basically to be part of their tikravot, part of their sacrifices. So the Rashba says, it's both. We don't want intermarriage, and that intermarriage is going to lead to Avodah Zarah. But that's not what the Ramban had said. Meaning the Ramban had it as just intermarriage as the issue. And I want to just point out the Tosfot in Avodah Zarah on Kaftet Amud Bet, they also back up this idea that actually what we're talking about is maybe we're talking about like two levels. It says v'yesh lomar, they say devada iga gzera b'stam yenam mishum b'notehem. We think that the essence of the prohibition of Gentile wine, and I would add, and a Gentile touching Jewish wine, is actually because of their daughters, meaning we want to prevent intermarriage. Mihu lo hayu osrim oto b'hana'a mitam zeh, but we wouldn't, if this was the reason for it, the only reason for it, we would not have said that it's prohibited to derive benefit also. Midi dehava apitan b'shamnam, right? Similar to when they were outlawing pat akum, or they were outlawing shemen akum, they were outlawing bread and oil. They didn't say you can't derive benefit. They said you just can't eat them. It says if the case was like oil and like bread, that the idea was we were trying to keep from intermarriage, it only would have been a prohibition to drink the wine. There wouldn't have been a prohibition on hana'ah, on deriving benefit. Ela avdu rabbanan ki yayin nesach gamor, but rather rabbanan, the rabbis, treat stam yenam as though it's full yayin nesach, libated wine. I think libated is the word. Shenit nasech lifnei avodat kochavim, that has been given, that has been poured out before Avodah Zarah, asur min haTorah, which is prohibited from the Torah, mishum dedamile, because it's similar to it. Vayayin nesech shoel Talmud minai. I'm going to leave that out because he's trying to explain a particular answer. So this is interesting. What the Tosfot have given us is the Tosfot have said, think about this for a minute. If it's mishum chatnut, if the worry is intermarriage, then it should only be prohibited to drink. If the worry is also yayin nesach, then we're going to make it asur b'hana'ah, prohibited to derive benefit, because then it's similar to yayin nesach. So maybe these are the two levels. Now the Rosh asks a really interesting question. He says, if you actually do think that the logic behind the Isser of Stam Yenam and Maga Akum is intermarriage, then how does it help anybody that the wine has been cooked? I understand if the logic is that we're worried that it's going to be libated, and we say they don't pour out cooked wine. That's not what they use for their pagan worship. But if the logic is about intermarriage, how does it help anybody to say, well, at least the wine's been pasteurized? Like, what difference does that make? So the Rosh has an interesting suggestion. He basically says, I do think that you can still maintain that the logic is mishum chatnut. We don't want intermarriage. And he says, ve'efshar, he says, maybe lefisha mevushal eno matzoi kol kach, because you don't usually find cooked wine, right? And that's still the case. Ask anybody who's a wine connoisseur. That's not mevushal is not like the standard, right? Because it's not so matsui, it's not so frequent, it's rare. Umilta de lo shchicha lo gazrube, right? We often have this klal, this rule that the rabbis do not make a gzera, they don't make a decree on something that is milta de lo shchicha, something that is not, doesn't happen frequently. So therefore he says, oh, doesn't happen frequently, so there's no gzera on it, right? It's not like there's a huge difference between boiled wine and not boiled wine in terms of what's going to get people drunk and making mistakes and a little bit too intimate with each other. It's we just don't make a gzera on something that is not that's rare. Okay. It's a really interesting suggestion that the Rush makes. He's really trying to work with the logic of it being because of intermarriage and trying to explain how Yain Mavushal helps. Now, I do think it's interesting. He then takes aim at the Rambam because the Rambam says that if you put dvash, if you put honey or some yeast into the wine, because that makes it not good for yayin nesach, not good as a pagan libation, then it's not even just a pagan libation. Excuse me, it's not a pagan libation. Why am I saying that? According to the Rambam, actually, what qualifies for yayin nesach are things that could be given on our mizbeach as nesach, which is an interesting question in and of itself. So he says, but you're not allowed to have dvash, and you're not allowed to have seor on the mizbeach. And so therefore, if you put a little bit of that in the wine, then it's something that doesn't go on the mizbeach. And therefore, that's similar to yain mevushal, and you can drink it, with a pagan, right? And the Rush really doesn't like this because the Rush says no, because the point of the gzera is not yain nesach. The point of the gzera is we don't want intermarriage. So I don't care how much honey you add in there, that's not going to work, right? So just very interesting to see some of the nafkaminas, some of the practical distinctions. But I do want to go back to this sense that the Balei HaTosfot, that the Tosafos gave us, that maybe if we're talking about due to intermarriage, it would only be a prohibition to drink. But if we're talking about yain nesach, that what we're worried about is the possibility of libation, then we would have an isser hana'ah as well, right? Then we would have a prohibition to derive benefit. And I think the reason why this is interesting, or when this becomes interesting, is when we start talking about not stam yenam of pagans, but stam yenam of Gentiles who are monotheists. There's no problem with Avodah Zarah. Not maga akum, but just maga nochri, right? A non-Jew who is not an idolater. So when you look at the Rambam also in Machalot Asurot, Forbidden Foods, chapter 11, he says, Ger Toshav, if you have somebody who's a resident alien, meaning not somebody who is a full convert, but they've accepted not to do Avodah Zarah, and they do the 7 mitzvot of Bnei Noach, there's a whole process to become a ger toshav. Okay, Kimoshe be'arnu, he says you should know yeno asur b'shtiya umutar b'hanaya. That person, their yayin, their wine. Remember, they're monotheists. Their wine would be prohibited to drink, and would be permitted to derive benefit from. And then it goes on, etc. It says, and I love that the term akum is used when it's not talking about akum, right? And any non-Jew who is not pagan, like Arabs, meaning like Muslims, he's talking about. Their wine is still prohibited in drinking, but is permitted to derive benefit. Now, he doesn't say why. People actually want to try to understand, especially if the whole point of the issue is yayin nesach, and there's no possibility of yayin nesach here. Why does he even care? Why should even the wine of Yishmaelim be usher to drink, right? And that's where we would say, Well, what do you mean? That's the layer of mishum chatnut, intermarriage. Because of intermarriage, we don't want you drinking their wine. We don't want them touching your wine. We don't want you engaging in wine in that same way. And then if there was also a yayin esach problem, we would also say no benefit allowed, right? And then he says, aval otam ha'ovdim akum, but those who do worship Avodah Zarah, stam yinam asur b'hanaya, their stam yayin would be a problem. Now, it turns out this is actually the work of the censor. What he actually says is, but Christians, because he thinks that the Trinity is Avodah Zarah even for Gentiles, technically speaking, it has that status. He says, but Christians, basically, you would still not just not be allowed to drink, but also not be allowed to derive benefit. Now, it's interesting because the Balei Tosfot do actually, in general, think that Christianity, even the Trinity, even though for Jews that would be Avodah Zarah, that is considered shituf. It's considered some sort of, like adding another, connecting another deity to God, to your worship of God, but not necessarily Avodah Zarah. They would not they would not classify Christianity as Avodah Zarah because it's about what's classified for the people whose wine it is, not what's classified for Jews, even though for a Jew it would be Avodah Zarah. So the Shulchan Aruch actually says, stam yinam shel amemin of de kochavim asur bahana v'hu adin lemaga'am beyayin shalanu. So Shulchan Aruch, plain as day says, if you have idolaters, if you have pagans, their stam yinam is a problem, and them touching our wine is a problem too. But then the Ramah says, mishum gzerat yayin shenasech le'elilim. The reason is because we're worried about wine that was poured out to Avodah Zarah. Ubizman hazeh, he says, she'eino shchiach she'haumot minaschim la'avodat kochavim, where you don't really find, for the most part, right, at least not in Western countries, you don't really find nations pouring out wine to idolatry. Yeshomrim demaga ovdei kochavim bayayin shelanu eno asur b'hana'ah rak b'shtiya, right? That some think that their touching our wine only prohibits us in drinking for us, but not in hana'ah, not in benefit. B'chein stam yayin shelahem eno asur lehanot mimenu, right? He says, and also their stam yinam, same thing, that it wouldn't be a problem of hana'ah, to derive benefit, it would only be a problem of drinking. And he says, v'lachein mutar ligbot bechovo mino veit kochavim stam yinam, right? So you would be able, if you had a chov, if you had a debt that was owed to you by a non-Jew, you could collect stam yenam for it, right? But he then goes on to say, I'm just dotting it for a second. He says, "Ava lechatchila asur liknoto lemachro kedei listaker bo." He says, lechatchila, we don't want you getting involved in this. And he says, "V'yesh mekilin gam bazen." And then there are those who are lenient, and he says v'tov lahachmir, but it's better to be machmir, right? So you see what's going on here. This whole question of the layer of mishum chatnut, intermarriage, which is you just can't drink it, and then the layer of mishum avodah zarah avodat elim, which is hana'ah. And you see how he's sort of going back and forth. He's not, incredibly comfortable with the idea of just letting it be mutar b'hana'ah. Okay, so that's a little bit about the logic of these things. Now, one thing I do want to say is, I think it was my first week in Israel when September 2024. And I went to the supermarket on a Friday and I was getting wine. And actually, the Muslim cashier asked me if I could check it out myself because he didn't even want to touch the bottle because of his religion. So I laugh at all this conversation about Yishmaelim and wine when there are some Muslims who won't even touch a bottle of wine, right? So it's just interesting, different theoretical versus practical, and for whom is it theoretical, for whom is it practical. I want to do one more thing before we end. I want to talk a little bit about the logic of something that may feel a little bit touchy, but I think it's worth going into, because it's always worth going into and understanding Torah carefully, which is, what about Jews who are not Shomer Shabbat, for example? Is there any issue of yayin there? Now, it's a weird question because what do you mean? What issue would there be? There's no problem of yayin nesech, and there's no problem of intermarriage, right? That's not our issue. But the fact is that there is a Gemara in Chulin on Daf Hey and Aleph 5a that says Mekablin korbanot mipushei Yisrael kedei shechzeru behem bitshuva. We accept sacrifices from any Jew so that they will do repentance. Chutz min hamumar umenasech et hayayin umechalel shabbatot befarhesia. Right, except for someone who is a mumar. Now, a mumar, we would say, it's somebody who is consistently transgressing, and there are different types, right? Consistently transgressing, and the Gemara would have to make clear, the poskim would have to make clear, what kind of mumar are we talking about? Is this a mumar because they like the way something tastes, or they're like a mumar lateavon, we would say, or they're mumar lahachis, or they somebody who's trying to like rebel against God. But either way, it's interesting to see the grouping of menasech yayin, someone who pours out libations to idolatry, yayin nesach, and mechalel shabbatot befarhesia, people who desecrate Shabbos in public. Right? That grouping is a pretty intense grouping. And there are poskim who do talk about, this does not come up in the Rambam, but it does come up elsewhere. I think the Bahag mentions this, the possibility of, well, maybe actually there's an issue with needing yain mavushal if you are having Jews at your table who are not keeping Shabbat or violating Shabbat in public. And I actually gave you a link because I think it's worth, for people who want to go down that rabbit hole, I think it's worth looking at some of the halakha l'maaseh on this, because it brings up lots of just different questions, right? Meaning, one question it brings up is, well, is there a difference between somebody who was religious and then decided to leave that, right? Is there a difference between that and somebody who was brought up not religious? Because after all, mechalel shabbatot befarhesia, we're assuming that this is somebody who knows that there's such a thing as really desecrating Shabbat, and doing that in public, they don't mind making that statement. Or alternatively, what about somebody who, mechalel shabbatot befarhesia, the way that Rashi explains it there is, we're talking about somebody who doesn't believe in divine creation of the world, meaning they're basically trying to say, I don't believe in what Shabbat stands for. But what about people who make Kiddush, but they don't keep Shabbat, right? You have that in a lot of Sephardi communities. You certainly have that in communities that identify as Reform and conservative, meaning people who make Kiddush, they believe that God created the world, they believe in what Shabbat stands for, but they're not keeping Shabbat in a halachic way, right? I'm not saying everybody in every community. I'm saying within certain communities, okay? That's also, some people think that there's room for leniency there because they say that's not what Mechalel Shabbat Befarhesia actually meant. I do think it's very interesting. And I gave you a link to something that Rabbi Jachter wrote. And I'm not necessarily endorsing where he comes down in the end in terms of psak, but I do think it's really interesting to see the conversation, because that would then add another part of a logic to this whole conversation, which is, a question of the porousness between Jew and non-Jew, and what the boundary line of the Jewish community looks like in different situations. So thanks, everybody. Always great learning with you. See you next time.